from a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, the top 10 reasons you should probably not eat that. And now, the podcast host who can eat just about anything, especially if it's a chicken sandwich at the drive-thru, Pete Dominick!
Oh, he knows my weakness, including fast food. Thank you, Pico, for another wonderful introduction. Thank you for joining me today. You won't be sorry after you hear this conversation with Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez. She is absolutely amazing. I gotta say, I think this book and her work is some of the most important that I've talked to here on the show, on the podcast. I am sorry I didn't get her on earlier when the book came out a little over 2 years ago. She is a professor of history at a Christian university, Calvin University. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's written 2 books, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, and A New Gospel for Women, Catherine Bushnell and the Challenge of Christian Feminism. And she's working on a 3rd book right now. She is a professor of history and gender studies. She's got a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, and so many more outlets. She's got a great new Substack as well. It's the Du Mez Connections on Substack. Look her up there and subscribe. So good. Catherine Stewart, who's joined me on this show, she wrote The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, says about Kristin's book, Jesus and John Wayne. She says it demolishes the myth that Christian nationalists simply held their noses to form a pragmatic alliance with Donald Trump. With brilliant analysis and detailed scholarship, Kristin Kobes Du Mez shows how conservative evangelical leaders have promoted the authoritarian patriarchal values that have achieved their finest representative in Trump. A stunning exploration of the relationship between modern evangelicalism, militarism, and American masculinity. And let me read one more review from Publishers Weekly. They say, an engaging history of the shifting ideal of Christian masculinity, persuasively arguing that the evangelical dismissal of Trump's flaws is the culmination of believing that, quote, God-given testosterone came with certain side effects. Du Mez closes with a bruising chapter on recent evangelical leaders' abuses and sex scandals. This lucid, potent history adds a much-needed religious dimension to understanding the current American right and the rise of Trump. That is just a couple quick reviews on the way into this interview. I'm not going to do anything here. Normally, I do a news segment, I have a little fun, but this is one of those interviews that I want to catalog in my favorite books or favorite guest interviews because it's so timely and relevant and evergreen. So important to know about what is in this book and what she's taught us here through a study of the history of gender and religion in our country for years. I mean, her scholarship is so impressive, and her career and this book. So let me just get right to it. Like I said, follow her on Substack. She's very active on social media. Please make a big splash on Twitter for the Stand Up with Pete Dominick audience by letting her know that you enjoyed her joining me. She's on Twitter at KK Du Mez, D-U-M-E-Z. Look for all information for her and all of my guests in the show notes. And remember, I can't do this without your support. I'm really heartened and inspired by several new subscribers and some longtime subscribers updating their subscription with a very generous raise. Thank you very much if that's one of you. And if you haven't subscribed, please sign up now. Go to standupwithpete.com so I can continue to do these great interviews with authors, journalists, academics, artists, and other amazing people, maybe even you. Many listeners of the show have become guests and friends of mine through the show and help us add to our community. And join us at tonight's Hangout, by the way. I almost forgot to say that. Before I get to my guest, don't forget, if you're a subscriber, you can hang out with us. My intern Odessa's going to be back. She's been a big hit. Always a great time on Thursday nights at 8 East. If you're a subscriber, you should be getting an email with a link to the Zoom chat. See you tonight. And now let's do it with Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez for the first time on Stand Up right now. It's so great to meet you and have you on the show, and congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here with you today.
Your book came out like
almost 2.5 years ago. And I kind of wanted to just go through what's happened and tell me some of the things that have happened both as a result of this book being published, the people that have helped promote it, and what's changed since it came out in your life, your career, and the subject matter.
Oh, yeah. So the book came out in the summer of 2020, just as the pandemic was kind of underway. And it was published with Norton's Live Right. And I mean, it had a great kind of first release. Everybody was happy with it. But about 3-4 months after it released, usually when books kind of start to quiet down, that's when it started to really catch on inside evangelical spaces. And if you know anything about evangelicals, they love books. And there's a lot of evangelicals, there's a lot of former evangelicals. And this book became very controversial in evangelical spaces. And so churches started studying it. And there's countless evangelical podcasters out there. If there's a white evangelical man who doesn't have a podcast, I probably haven't met him. And so the book really took on there in those spaces. And then January 6th happened. And I think that kind of catalyzed things because my book is about evangelical masculinity and militarism and really kind of questioning how can these good-hearted Christian folks support anti-democratic measures and condone violence. And so it caught on again in the national media and shot up eventually to the New York Times bestseller list. And honestly, I'm still kind of in that space, giving a lot of interviews every week and giving a lot of talks. And I would love for the book to become less relevant any day.
Do you think that the book, you're a historian, do you think that the book should be taught in history classes and AP classes, God forbid, in high schools or public schools, much less private universities?
Yeah, I mean, especially in Florida, right?
Yeah.
No, it is. It's being taught in Ivy League classrooms, in a lot of Christian universities, Christian colleges. It's a work of history, right? It's a work of history. The footnotes are there. The methodology is very solid. It's just U.S. history. But I think what's been so surprising is that in evangelical spaces, they have so long kind of controlled their own narrative. They have written their own histories about themselves. And so they've missed a lot of the story. And that's what's so kind of revolutionary about this book. In scholarly circles, it's not a controversial book. In evangelical spaces, it's shocking.
You mentioned how every white, straight evangelical man has a podcast, and you've been on a lot of them. I think one of the best things about you is that you are happy to and willing to engage with your critics in good faith anywhere, anytime, or within reason, whether it be social media or in long responses. And I think that is, brings you and your work so much credibility. But what have those challenges been like? I mean, have those people been fair with you in many ways?
So first of all, a lot of white evangelicals, straight, complementarian even men, so conservatives, have been extremely fair, and they have received this book extremely, extremely humbly, and have invited me into their spaces and given me, kind of good faith conversation. They have been incredible. Then there's a subset who has been less than fair, I would say, of some folks at some prominent SBC institutions who have really tried to, smear me, drag me on social media, and really, call me out as a heretic. So it's a theological attack, not a kind of academic critique. I'm actually a person of faith myself. I'm a Christian, so I'm in these spaces a lot. I love it. I'm a historian who, up until now, I've only written about people who are dead. So to get to interact with people who are alive and pushing back and receiving this, it's actually kind of thrilling.
Are you a heretic?
It really is going to depend on who you ask. I'm pretty basic. I'm Midwestern, mom of three, member of my local church here, and I teach at a Christian university. So, you'll have to be the judge of that.
I won't be the judge of. I don't think I really use the word. I don't really have any standing to use or call anybody heretic. Although I love talking and learning about the issues that you're an expert on. So I might call somebody a hypocrite, certainly when it comes to many of these things that they profess to believe and practice, which you've written so much about. What about this woman, Beth Moore? Who is she, and what did her signaling or promotion of your work and your book do? What changed kind of overnight?
Yeah. Yeah. Beth Moore is, or used to be, kind of the most famous Southern Baptist woman in the country. Has for a couple of decades been, or a few decades now, been leading Bible studies. She was very, very popular among evangelical women, published with the SBC publisher, Lifeway Christian Books, and just huge figure, beloved. But largely ignored by men, right? There's kind of these divided cultures in evangelicalism. She was a women's Bible study leader because, women aren't supposed to be teaching men theology. And then social media came along, and she is a master on, if you aren't following her on Twitter, you should. It's a blast. And that meant that she could engage the national audience and that men could see what she was doing. And everything really came to a head in the aftermath of the release of the Access Hollywood tapes. Right, where she, as this evangelical woman, as a survivor herself, calls out her fellow evangelicals saying, enough is enough. You cannot support this abuser. Right. And she was wrong. She ended up getting pushed out of the SBC. Her business, which was this huge kind of empire of Christian publishing, much, much smaller, more humble these days. And she took a lot of flack and continues to take a lot of flack. She posted about the book. She was reading it with her daughter as they were on a road trip. And she posted that it was just shocking to her. She kind of joked that she wanted to have her daughter pull over the car and just run her over, because she realized not only was it true, because she had seen the ugly side of this culture very recently, was seeing it, but also because she realized she had participated in it and she was complicit. And that was such an honest and humble response.
Gosh, that must have been profoundly impactful to you personally to hear someone with her influence give that reaction after reading your book.
It was. And I've since met with her, talked with her. And honestly, as I was writing the book, I was writing it up to the present. And so I was watching what was happening to her in real time. I was watching the backlash against Russell Moore, also one of the prominent leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention. When they came out against Trump, when they spoke out against abuse, the backlash was just brutal. And so as I was writing, I was thinking, oh, guys, I think I can help you understand, because it just felt like such utter betrayal to them. They were blindsided. But what I knew was there was this much longer history behind what was happening.
Well, Beth Moore and Russell Moore aren't alone, right? There's hundreds of, I'm sure thousands of evangelicals who are like, no, this guy's crazy. This guy's an abuser. I can't support it. Where's everybody going? Why is everybody's leaving the church? Where are you going? Whether you had a huge following on your radio show, your podcast, your YouTube, your TV show, whatever it is, if you came out against Trump, but specifically in circles of evangelicals, which was the most obvious place for it, you would think people would be like, this guy's a monster. If you came out against him, you were minimized, marginalized, pushed out, lost your following, maybe even lost your ability to make a living, much less be a leader. How fair is that? How accurate is that? How many people do you think that affected? Leaders, religious leaders?
Oh, it's affected. I can't even put a number on it. We're talking leaders, just individuals, leaders, pastors, local pastors. I know personally a number of evangelical pastors who have been pushed out of their churches over Trump and over simply saying, let's look at the Bible here. We can't, just uncritically support everything this guy says. That's going to cause you trouble. But it's not just the leaders. You'll have people working in Christian schools who have been fired. You've got just church workers, people in Christian nonprofits. There is this massive world out there that people who aren't evangelical might know nothing about. And also to the level of families. I know so many evangelicals whose families, churches, communities have just been ripped apart over this issue. And so many of them feel isolated and alone. And I think one of the things this book does is it helps them realize this, it wasn't you. You're not alone. You're part of something much bigger. Yeah.
I'm sure you hear that a lot. I know I watched one interview and it was like a year old, that interview where you said you'd gotten like 1,000 letters. Yeah. And that made it seem like you're actually getting handwritten letters, because you don't say, I don't know, maybe you're referring to emails. But anyway, you've gotten, I'm sure at this point, tens of thousands, if not more, people writing to you, talking to you about probably to some extent what your book, how it affected them. in, and I would imagine, positive ways. And so that's my question. I mean, I remember growing up hearing George Carlin for the first time and thinking, what? Because he really made me question a lot of things. And I'm sure a lot of young people have that. It could be an artist of any kind, a musician. They listen and they're affected. They've never heard these ideas before. In this case, in many ways, your book helps people understand, because you're a historian, history, and the things that they've learned are not necessarily in the scriptures, or they've been changed, or they've been, in many ways Americanized, I think it's fair to say. So what do you hear from your readers and folks about how their life trajectory or even their faith has been challenged, changed, or transformed?
So from so many readers, I hear some version of the same thing, which is, this is the story of my life. And then they just pour out the details of their story, some of which overlap almost perfectly with every single chapter of this book. So, my family was influenced by Bill Gothard and his, horrible teachings. I went to the Promise Keepers rally in Washington, D.C. I read Driscoll. I worked at Mars Hill. Like, all of this is my story, but I never could understand how all these pieces fit together. So from what I hear from a lot of readers, it's liberating to read this book. It's liberating to see this makes sense. All of those feelings of unease and, kind of my despair at what I was seeing around me in 2016 and my personal experiences, maybe a marriage that just didn't work based on this purity culture or patriarchy. All of this suddenly just made so much sense. So I think it's actually just a liberating experience for a lot of people. And it's really awesome that history, just plain historical research, can do that for people and help them understand their own lives.
Well, I really want to get more into the book and your work. It's just so fascinating. Gosh, I am so lucky to get to talk to you. At one point, I was like, maybe I'm spending too much time with Kristin Du Mez's work, because I'm so enjoying it. It's so important, and I'm really happy to talk to you about it. But I've got to just kind of again stick to what's happened since. Book comes out 2.5 years ago. You mentioned January 6th. I just watched that HBO documentary on it. I like 4 hours in the insurrection on January 6th or something it's called. I've talked to a lot of the Capitol Police officers. I'm pretty obsessed with that, as many Americans are. And January 6th kind of like is a lot of your work and book playing out on that day. When you watch that documentary and I'm reading your work at the same time, I'm reliving that day and reading your work. I'm like, these guys, the way they're dressing, the things that they're saying, the things that they're doing in the name of, and how it seems like they feel like this is a huge part, certainly was to them, a part of history. And you have often said, Jesus and John Wayne, it might as well have been called Jesus and Braveheart, because Mel Gibson's character, William Wallace, in that, it really played out on January 6th in so many ways. Talk to me about that day and use that day to kind of maybe illustrate so much of the research that you put in this book. It really was a culmination, it seems.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Braveheart. I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with Braveheart only because evangelical men have been obsessed with Braveheart. And for those who don't know this world, I mean, by obsessed, I mean, from the 1990s on, evangelical pastors were showing clips of Braveheart, this freedom rallying cry. Mel Gibson's William Wallace was like their ideal man, and they wanted to pattern their Christian lives after that. And if you watch the movie, you could see how that could go wrong in a lot of different directions. On January 6th, there was one man who was carrying a poster of Braveheart. And I actually wrote about this in, it was like a Trump-like figure holding this severed head of Karl Marx, I think it was, with a bloody sword. And
that is I give him high grades. That's creative.
Exactly. And the whole Braveheart kind of costume, and it said Braveheart on it. And so I was actually asked to write about that for an online exhibit at the Smithsonian that has documented religion and January 6th. So shout out to that. Check it out. There's some really interesting visual images and analysis there. But what we saw on January 6th was a lot of Christian symbolism. We saw, first of all, the Proud Boys kneeling in prayer as they're walking towards the Capitol. And I caught audio of that prayer. I heard it. And it sounds like any prayer that could be offered in any evangelical church on any given Sunday, right? So one of the tensions here is what's extremist and what's mainstream. And that's a question that I brought to January 6th, too, because, of course, they're extremists who are storming the Capitol. And you see the Christian flag, and you have the gallows, and I saw this guy with an arm patch that said the army of God, or the Lord's army. And I went and I looked, where did he get that? Well, it's available at Vacation Bible Study or Vacation Bible School supply stores, right? Because kids like to, go to summer camp, and I'm in the Lord's army kind of thing. And this is a common theme for these things. So yes, the Christian symbolism was everywhere on that day, though it was an extremist event. But for me, as a cultural historian, my question is, to what extent do mainstream, ordinary evangelical folks, ordinary Americans, also sympathize with what was happening there, and then why?
It's so well detailed in the book. Let's get into some. I'm actually particularly interested in hearing you talk about, because you give a long history, but the 60s are really interesting because of race, LGBT issues, but especially the Vietnam War, where we were really losing. A lot of guys were dying, and there were a lot of stories coming out of that war of Americans doing bad things, and that was new. So as a reaction to that, the evangelical community had a lot to say, and it played a huge, important part. Maybe, I don't know, talk to me a little bit about the 60s.
Yeah. So first, in the early Cold War, that was an absolutely critical time for American evangelicals, because it was then that they moved from really kind of the backwaters of American society, post-Scopes trial, right, into the mainstream, where you have Billy Graham in and out of the Eisenhower White House. And they were able to do that in part because this was consensus America, kind of leave it to Beaver family values. It was Cold War. The enemy was communism. It was clear anti-God, anti-family, anti-American. So evangelicals were right inside the mainstream. And it was easy for them to then have this feeling of cultural power. All that changed in the 60s. The civil rights movement challenges the status quo in the American South in particular, who are white Southerners. A lot of them are white evangelicals, right? You have, desegregation is resisted by Christian communities like Jerry Falwell Sr., his church, his school, and you have a lot of these Christian schools founded as segregation academies. The feminist movement challenges these quote unquote traditional gender roles, and then Vietnam. And the anti-war movement especially challenges conceptions of American goodness and American greatness. And it's in reaction to all of those that they kind of rally around this reactionary kind of traditional red-blooded American masculinity, the good guy with the gun. Because if you think of all those kind of destabilizing influences, it's the assertion of white patriarchal authority that is the solution to all of them. And this becomes a kind of symbol, and it's interpreted in Christian spaces as this is God-ordained masculinity. But it's not limited there. And that's the John Wayne part of this, right? In secular society as well, John Wayne comes to embody these values on screen and off. And you see this kind of coalescing where we can really understand our modern kind of political realignment, which is secular and religious conservatives uniting around this cultural identity.
Yeah, I said LGBT. I meant the feminist movement, like civil rights, feminism in the Vietnam War in the 60s. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Cold War stuff, which you go deep into in the book as well. And Graham and Falwell. And then, of course, we get to abortion, I guess, in the early 70s. And I've talked to so many constitutional scholars and academics and other people about the history of abortion legally and religiously in this country. And you have obviously touched on that in your book. Where does that come in?
Mm-hmm. So first, there's a longer history within Christianity, kind of globally, and within American Christianity of being anti-abortion. And I want to put that out there because there's also scholarship that has shown how race actually mobilized the religious right more than abortion did, which is also accurate in its early years. And so, like I said, you have evangelicals like Falwell, the moral majority, first motivated politically around protecting segregation and fighting off the IRS to protect their white flight schools. That is all true. But over the course of the 1970s, that's when you see abortion becoming this partisan political issue, mobilizing political issue. Now, a couple of very interesting things to note. In the 1960s, you had a lot more variation within conservative Christian circles, conservative evangelical circles around the issue of abortion. Nobody was out there saying, this is awesome, everybody should go get an abortion, at least not that I've seen in the documents. But a lot said, this is a really difficult moral choice. You had the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, come out in the early 70s multiple times with a pro-choice platform. Women ought to decide in conversation with their pastor, with their family, with their doctors, right? And so this complicated theological moral issue, by the end of the 70s, no more. It has become a staunch, it's simple. There's one moral choice here, and that the government needs to enforce this. We need to overturn Roe v. Wade because of their idea of Christian America. Because if the government allows abortion or even funds it or encourages it, since we are God's special nation, we will be punished. We will lose God's blessing and we will suffer as a nation. If we want to secure God's blessing, it's not just what you yourself do and what you choose as an individual or as a woman or as a family. It is what this country does. And so you see how abortion it moves to the center of evangelical political identity.
Tell me more about how evangelicals see the United States as God's special nation. And does that coincide with like Jesus and an American flag holding a machine gun type of imagery?
100%. So there's this very strong kind of mythology inside conservative evangelical spaces that America was founded as a Christian nation. And what they mean by that is essentially all the founding fathers, they kind of envision as, contemporary conservative white evangelical guys. And, read that back on history. All sorts of historians have debunked this. Like, yes, most were Christians. Yes, they believed in God. Yes, all of this is true, but not in the way that you're suggesting. And many evangelical historians, like legitimate evangelical historians, have pushed back against this for decades now. But that hasn't really touched the power of this mythology in evangelical spaces. You've got these kind of pseudo historians like David Barton and his Wall Builders organization, and just all sorts of like Christian radio, Christian television, just promoting this mythical view of this evangelical nation. So what that means then is, especially since the 1960s, we've lost that. We've lost Christian identity. We've lost Christian supremacy. And we need to restore that. We need to restore Christian America. Now, how do we do that? Well, the threat is real. And in the case of Cold War, the threat was military. You need strong men. You need men willing to fight because the threats are so great. And because the enemy is so powerful, you need to be ruthless, right? You need, this is the good guy with the gun motif. Again, this is the Braveheart theme. Kind of, right? The good guy has to use violence to achieve righteousness in order. And so 100%, this idea of this rugged, ruthless, masculine power goes hand in hand with Christian America because you have to defend it.
I'm going to say something that I think kind of encapsulates a lot of your work, but there's just no way to do that. And I certainly don't want to minimize it. But you talk about the consumer culture within the evangelical movement. And you have a lot of these debates and refer, basically to history as a scholar in many ways. And it seems like, there's not a lot of debating a lot of this because it's not that debatable. But what they have done in this consumer culture is they've created their own brand of what they want to describe as their religion. In this case, evangelical Christianity, but whatever. It's their brand, and it's been done through this consumer culture, which you just briefly touched on. But am I right about that? Is that who you are generally arguing with when you are arguing? Often you're arguing as a historian versus someone who's talking about things that they just kind of created over years at the Prager University or whatever you want to mention, Falwell's.
Right, exactly. There's this powerful evangelical consumer culture, media culture that is largely invisible to people on the outside of it. So, I mean, even as I was writing, right, my editor, who's not from this world at all, flagged some of my publication figures. This book sold 4 million copies. This sold 10 million. And he's just like, no, Kristin, where'd you get this? You need to know that, publishers always inflate these numbers. And I said, oh, it was in the New York Times. And he said, oh, okay, never mind then. That's legit.
Right.
But these books are not making the New York Times bestseller list because it's a curated list and their readers don't want to read this stuff. And so those books are not surfacing there. But they're hugely influential, right? You've got the Christian radio networks, massive, massive power, hundreds of millions of listeners in this country and globally, invisible if you're not tuning in to those stations, right? And so what these media sources and, what this consumer culture does is it's kind of chicken and egg. First of all, it puts this stuff out there, but the consumers, then the demand is there. And so the money is there. These are not nonprofits, right? There is so much money changing hands here. And so what that means is if you try to disrupt this, if you have a conscience and as a songwriter, as the owner of a Christian radio station, as a writer, if you disrupt this narrative, you are going to be dropped. The publishers aren't going to publish your book. The distribution networks are going to drop you, and so much for your career and for your family finances, right? So this is how this works, and I wanted to make that culture visible, and then I wanted to say, and what is being kind of communicated, promoted through that culture, and how do they draw the boundaries? Who's in, who's out, and how's that enforced?
It's interesting to talk with anybody about books that made a big impact in their life. And if you grew up in a certain place at a certain time, a lot of people can agree, oh yeah, I remember the first time I read anything from Judy Blume to Shakespeare. I don't know. But usually people have, of a certain generation, we're all familiar with the same kind of group of books or authors, whatever it might be. But in the evangelical community, there are books that most of us have never heard of, even you growing up with your religious background, Christianity. And one of them, apparently for you, was this Wild at Heart by, is it William Aldridge? Do I have that right?
Jon Aldridge.
Wild at Heart.
Yes.
And you found out about this book. Tell me about, and that's kind of what sparked a lot of your interest in your work years ago. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I started the research for what became Jesus and John Wayne more than 15 years ago. I'm a professor at a Christian university in Michigan, and I had just given a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt and talked about his kind of militant white masculinity and how it was linked to economics and foreign policy and race and empire. And students in my class, a couple of guys came up and said, Professor Du Mez, you've got to read this book. And it was Jon Aldridge's Wild at Heart, which I'd heard about because my own church was hosting men's Bible studies, studying this. All the guys in the dorms of Christian colleges were reading this book. It was just not my cup of tea. I was trying to avoid it until I took their advice. I opened it up and I saw exactly what they were talking about because Aldridge quotes Teddy Roosevelt right up front and it goes on to describe this very militaristic construction of quote unquote Christian manhood. And this was in the early years of the Iraq War. And I knew I had all this survey data showing how evangelicals, more than any other Americans, were promoting war, preemptive war in general, the Iraq War, condoning torture. And so I just thought, okay, what does one of these things have to do with the other? And yes, these were profoundly influential books. Talk to any white evangelical man over the age of 30, and chances are he hasn't just read Wild at Heart, but he's read it in a close group with other men at the advice of a pastor in a Bible study and received it, as God's truth.
I covered the Iraq War. I have interviewed, I think, everybody on all sides of it, and specifically including a lot of different parts. But the issue of torture is a good example, I think, to talk about. I always really struggled with anybody being okay with that. Certainly after you had someone like John McCain talking about it, pretty tough guy. And talking about how horrible it is and we should always be against it no matter what. But so many Americans were supportive. But yeah, when I found out that so many Christians, people who identified, and as any religion, were for it, I always just struggle with it. I continue to struggle with it. Tell me more about why that is, whether it be war, whether it be torture, or anything else, how they can get behind such violence.
Yeah, so I can't even remember if I included this little tidbit in the book, but there's actually a Christian devotional written around remember that TV series 24?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, which feature torture. There's a Christian devotional based on that series, 24, which was honestly, I read it. It was just so bizarre. I don't know that I ended up engaging it in the book because I didn't even know what to do with it. But yeah, so torture. Why are so many Christians okay with it? There's very much this ends justifies the means mentality. And so caught up in this is the idea of victimization. We will be victimized by fill in the blank, by secular humanists, by the left, by radical Islam, by the Democratic Party, right? They are out to get us, absolutely. And they are on the side of the devil. And so we are on the side of God. Therefore, whatever we do is justified and it is righteous. And this is how that works. And so there's this victim mentality that perpetuates violence against the presumed aggressors. So I have a chapter in the book called Why We Want to Kill You. And my editor at first was like, this is a bit much. And then he came back. He's like, no, I think it's about right. That's actually the name of a book written by one of these, like, it was very popular the years after 9/11 in the Christian kind of speaking circuit, the Christian world, these fake ex-Muslim terrorists, guys who said that they were radical jihadists. And then they were converted to evangelical Christianity. And they went on the speaking circuit in evangelical churches and colleges to tell everybody about this great threat. And one of them came to my colleges. And my colleague, who's a scholar of Islam, like immediately, within minutes, was like, this guy's a fraud. He doesn't make any sense. And so he actually contacted the president of Focus on the Family, who was sponsoring this guy. And turns out they knew he was a fraud. And they kept sponsoring him. And these guys, these fake ex-Muslim terrorists, many of them are still on the speaking circuit today. This is how this world works, right? And so what is this doing?
I'm sorry, I did not realize that there are fake. When you say fraud, these are people who said they were
completely lie, completely make up stories.
They're, as we call them now, Santoses.
Perfect example.
No disrespect to all the Santoses.
Felt so familiar. That's it. Yes. No, it's exactly that. Like completely fabricate every detail of their past life.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then they're right. So my question was, why is this happening? What is this doing for? It's clear what it's doing for them. They make a lot of money. What is it doing for the Christian organizations that continue to sponsor them? But if you can build up this notion of we are so embattled, then extreme responses are not just allowed, but required.
Wow. I want to talk to you about gender stuff. You're also a historian of gender, and it's something that I think about, care about so much. I think, without sounding too virtuous, just to let you know, like as a young man, my brother was teaching me about feminism. I don't know where he got it from. I mean, my parents are fairly progressive and so on, but I just always was curious about it. And then as the dad to two daughters, and looking at life through their eyes, I'm thinking about it constantly in terms of my role modeling, reading. And I'm so proud of both of them for being, they're 15 and 18. David just turned 18 and they're confident, they're independent. The idea that they would be in some subservient to anybody. I mean, even we don't even love hierarchy in my family, but like a man, like gender-based subservient is bizarre to them. It's bizarre to me. Tell me some of the things that people still believe in the evangelical community and kind of where they come from in terms of gender dynamics and inequities. Because to me, that's race and anti-racism and anti-sexism, but specifically the things that you're an expert on are the most important issues in American culture today. What do they believe and why do they believe it? How could you, I'm this ignorant. How could you possibly be this person subservient to your husband, your partner? It's flabbergasting in 2023.
So what evangelicals would say to you is the Bible says it, right? And God has designed society to function in this way. He has designed men and women to function in this way. And they will point to some specific passages in the Bible about women that appear to say women should be under the authority of their husbands. Women should not preach in church. And that women should submit to masculine authority, right? And there are some passages that need to be dealt with in the Old Testament and especially in the New Testament. My first book was all on feminist theology, from historical feminist theology offering some pretty compelling counter interpretations of these passages and showing, in fact, how Christians and how evangelicals had offered some pretty faulty translations of some of these passages, right, to overemphasize the patriarchal dimensions. Now, there's also in the scriptures a whole lot of passages that disrupt hierarchies. Right. So in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither male nor female. And, you have the women at the cross being the first to go tell the good news of, Jesus' resurrection, which is preaching, right? Preaching the gospel. And so you've got the Bible's going to give you kind of sources for either side or a whole spectrum of beliefs here. So as a historian, what always interests me is why are these Christians in this moment choosing this set of interpretations?
Right.
And then what I see or document in evangelical spaces is not just that they went with like the most patriarchal interpretations possible of particular texts in terms of like women not being allowed to preach and have religious authority and things like that, but then they add a whole bunch of kind of cultural layers to that. So a woman can't be a police officer because that's exercising authority. Women have to dress modestly because otherwise they're going to tempt men. If a man, if there's any sexual misconduct, clearly it's a woman's fault because she tempted him. But all of these like anti-biblical ideas that get layered on top, and they seem shocking. But what's like the saddest thing is almost every day I hear from women who grew up in these spaces, who are still in these spaces, and they testify to what this means for them. They aren't allowed to go to college. Many experience sexual abuse, and they don't even know to call it sexual abuse.
Right.
They don't even have that terminology. I mean, the stories are harrowing.
Talk to me more about the women's fault thing. I've heard you talk about some pretty horrible situations where men do horrible things to their own family members, to women, young women, and then they blame the woman. It's speechless.
Yeah. So going back to the 60s and 70s, evangelicals were writing a whole lot of books on how to be a Christian wife, how to be a Christian woman, and they're producing a whole lot of sex manuals. A lot of sex manuals. Before our bodies ourselves, evangelicals were already in that industry. And many of these are quite graphic because they're trying to teach these modest women how to kind of sexually fulfill their husbands just as soon as they're married. But the ideology goes like this. God created men and women completely different, like opposite. And God created men, filled them with testosterone, and they have a very aggressive sex drive. That's just the way God made them, right? So it's up to women who are created very differently to preserve virtue. They have to be modest so they don't tempt men. And when they do marry, boom, they have to meet their husband's every sexual need, which we already know, there's a lot of those needs. And so this is the kind of framework. So what happens if a man is abusive? If a man abuses a young child? It was shocking to read these reports over and over again. The wife was not fulfilling his sexual needs. The little girl clearly must have tempted him. And so much forgiveness so quickly for the man, for the patriarch, and so much guilt and shame for the women. Now, I was reading this like historically as I was seeing, Me Too start to unfold in church too. And I knew that there was this long pattern of abuse and cover up in Christian spaces. I mean, this is what Beth Moore was talking about. She knew it too. So many women knew it. There is a long history. And since the book came out, there was I can't remember what happened. As I was writing, I think at the very end, the expose on the Southern Baptist Convention. Massive decades of abuse. And it's not just the perpetrators, right? There's always going to be bad guys out there, but it was the systemic cover up and enabling the abuse to continue in churches for decades. And frankly, that is continuing today.
What do you, if you wrote about that, I missed this, but what do you make of this? Everybody's always talked about and known a lot more about the Catholic Church and it's just endemic abuses. I grew up Catholic, but a lot of times people attribute that to priests not being able to be married. And if only they weren't, they were able to to have sex and be married, they wouldn't have these temptations. And then, smarter people, I think, probably talk about power. It's more about power. But what about the fact that no matter what religion, and it's obviously not exclusive to Christianity, this always seems to be pervasive in the most fundamental forms, and maybe there's more. How do you compare the sexual crimes that are endemic in many of these religious communities? How do you compare them or think about them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is about power, for sure. And for a long time, evangelicals, kind of watching the Catholic scandals unfold, like to tell themselves, that's Catholic, right. That's not us, right? And in response to Me Too, Church to the revelations I include in Jesus and John Wayne, a lot of evangelical leaders had to say, we were wrong. We were absolutely wrong. But evangelicalism is not kind of united in the same hierarchy. And so it's hard to track down all the moving parts, right? And so this corruption exists just across the evangelical world. So what is it about these religious communities? I don't know that religious people are any worse than non-religious people. But if you look at the kind of theologies and how this works, it works against women identifying this as abuse because they're told they have to submit to masculine authority. They're also told if anything happens, if you have any complaints, you have to bring it to your father or bring it to your pastor or bring it to the church. Keep it inside the church. Don't involve law enforcement. And they'll point to a couple of Bible passages that are purportedly say this, right? And so the cover up is kind of built into the system. And then there's this enormous pressure exerted on survivors, on victims, not to go public because it will hurt the witness of the church. Right? You don't want to hurt this man's ministry. Because souls are at stake. And if you make us look bad, you will make God look bad. And you don't really want to do that. Do you? That happens over and over again. And so many women agree. They don't want to make the church look bad. They are deeply devout Christians themselves. And so they're caught up in this mess.
We go back to race just real quick and, talk about the role that plays. And I don't know if there's any way to work this in, but I am just totally obsessed, outraged with everything that's happened in our schools. I'm in the fight in my own local Board of Education and have been for a couple of years here against these people who are, terrified of what's being taught in the schools. They want to ban books. They're screaming about CRT. You're following what happened in Florida where Ron DeSantis has passed a law, the anti-woke law BS, and of course made this announcement where they just said this AP, advanced placement class, which is the kind of class that you take to get ready for college on African-American history. He said he made a news conference about it and saying it's not allowed. It's illegal. What about this game, this playbook? Have you seen before? This is not new. This is race in America. And I wonder how it, leads into your work.
Yeah. So in conservative white evangelical spaces, they will be quick to affirm that racism is wrong. And then they will be very quick to affirm that it's not really a problem anymore. And so there's this myth of color blindness that has been profoundly influential in evangelical spaces. We don't see race. Right? We love everybody just like Jesus loves everybody. Doesn't matter the color of your skin as long as you embrace this ideology, right? As long as you become one of us. But if you can challenge any of this and point out systemic injustice, no. So there's a long history in evangelical spaces of squashing that kind of racial justice rhetoric and instead opting, if for anything at all, racial reconciliation. Change your heart, love your neighbor. So in these Promise Keeper rallies, for example, which was where racial reconciliation was really taken on, with a lot of good intentions, but it was all very individualistic. So white men, Black men turn to each other and apologize for your racial prejudice, right? No understanding of systemic inequality and of the ways that white Christians in the South and the North have actively contributed to that. And so there's this long history here. Now, the other thing that's really important to realize is any acknowledgement of racial prejudice strikes at the heart of Christian nationalism.
Right.
Because Christian nationalism has this myth that America was a good country from its founding. And so you get something like the 1619 Project and says, well, wait a minute here. Explain how a quote unquote Christian nation can decimate Native Americans, can enslave Black populations, right? African populations. Explain again how that's Christian. That strikes at the heart of this like kind of primary identity that we are God's chosen people and this is our country. And so education disrupts that. History disrupts that. Just plain old history. You don't need CRT, nothing against CRT, but you don't need it. All you have to do is read basic American history and it will mess with any myth of Christian America. And that's what DeSantis and other conservatives are trying to get rid of. They don't want people reading that actual history because it will disrupt their power.
Yeah, so well said, so well said. What do you see as is it even fair for me to ask you, do you give your opinion on how you see the threats that we face in America as a result of the Christian nationalist movement, which I know you've talked about? Maybe we need to unpack that term the way that you describe it.
So a lot of sociologists are doing really good work on Christian nationalism, and you can get a whole a bunch of kind of very precise definitions in the book. I simply describe it as the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and needs to be defended as such. Now, what that means, that's where things get interesting. And when I was researching this book, I was kind of shocked, kind of coming from the edges of this culture. I hadn't realized when I was, younger and kind of a part of this, how anti-democratic this world really was. Because the idea of kind of Christian America is that what needs to be done is to restore what was lost, right? And so what was lost was, Christian supremacy, really. And so we need to restore that. And that is more fundamental than our Constitution and more fundamental than our democracy. Because why would you want to put enemies of God in charge of this country? You don't want that, right? And so that's where you see Christian nationalism. This is where we have all sorts of supporting data. Christian nationalists are more likely to not be troubled by voter suppression, much more likely to embrace election denialism. They are likely to be anti-immigrant. They are likely to be pro-law enforcement and to deny that there's any racial prejudice in law enforcement, to deny racial prejudice generally, right? You have all of these factors that come together, and more likely, it's correlated with agreeing that violence might be necessary to protect the country. And so this is what we're talking about in terms of Christian nationalism. It is thoroughly anti-democratic, because one of the things that's happened recently is that we're in the midst of some pretty dramatic demographic shifts in this country. What Robbie Jones has called the end of white Christian America, right? Demographically. And so whereas a generation or two ago, you could want to kind of take back America by mobilizing voters through democratic methods, the numbers aren't on your side anymore. And so there's a lot more willingness now to throw democracy aside, the Constitution aside, and apply it unequally to privilege conservative white Christianity.
You're so good at this. You're a treasure. You're an American treasure, Kristin. I mean, your work is just so amazing and important. I'm so thankful and grateful to have you join me today. And I am subscribing to the Substack. I'm going to finish the book. I hope that you'll come back and talk to us again, or maybe even our do a live event with listeners that I'm sure have a lot of questions for you. I know you're in a much demand. I will be in the future part of that demand, because I am so grateful for your work. It's excellent. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate you and everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I had a great time.
All right, there she goes, Professor Kristin Du Mez. I hope you liked it, and I hope that you will let her know on Twitter at KK Du Mez, and check out all the rest of the information for Kristin at the show notes for each and every episode. Oh, man, I had my mind blown getting ready for that interview, reading the book, and I can't wait to talk to her again at the end of the interview after I press stop. She said she's been turning down most interview requests. She's just been inundated, but she made an exception for me, which I thought was really nice. She said something very flattering to me, so that meant a lot to me, and hopefully it meant a lot to you that we can get these great guests on the show, but I can't do it without you. So subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already right now, and I'll see you tonight at the Hangout at 8 Eastern. I hope Go thank Kristin on Twitter and social media, anywhere else that you heard her here, and hopefully we can get her back soon. Wow, what an unbelievable guest interview and book. Go get it right now. That's all I've got for you today. I'll be back tomorrow with Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. Hopefully I'll get Christian and Ophira to talk to me, and Eric Siegel and I are going to have a very special conversation I believe I'll be dropping over the weekend about the passing of his father. There's just a few things coming up here on the show. All right, I'm out of words. I love you. Bye-bye.
Stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.